When one considers the legacy of Ronald Reagan, few moments stand as sharply reflective as his 1987 radio address to the nation on free and fair trade, in which he warned, high tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. That statement was mobilized recently by the Canadian province of Ontario in an advertising campaign citing Reagan's words to criticize rising tariffs, specifically those introduced by Donald Trump and his administration. The reaction was swift, sharp and politically charged. Trump accused the campaign of misrepresenting Reagan, labeled it fake, and subsequently terminated trade negotiations with Canada. In the editorial referenced in the video, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal argued that the current tariff strategy under Trump is a contradiction of Reagan's trade beliefs, and went on to say that he shouldn't get away with taking Reagan's trade beliefs in vain. The gist: by invoking Reagan's name and legacy in support of large tariff increases, Trump is misappropriating principles that Reagan himself largely disavowed. The editorial's broader point is that the hefty tariffs on Canada, and by extension other trading partners, represent both a strategic and philosophical departure from the kind of global trade engagement Reagan championed. What makes this dispute noteworthy is how it highlights the interplay of history, economic policy and international diplomacy. Reagan wasn't an unqualified free trade zealot. In fact, he did impose tariffs on Japanese semiconductors in 1987. But even in doing so, he emphasized that such measures were steps he was loath to take, and that they were exceptions rather than the rule. The broader thrust of his radio address was to warn against the logic of tariff escalation. The more one leans on them, the more one invites retaliation, and the more one erodes competitiveness, raises costs and stunts growth. By contrast, Trump's tariff strategy is far more aggressive and unapologetic. Since his return to power in 2025, his administration has raised average American tariff rates to the highest level since 1934, according to some analyses, and has embraced import taxes as a key tool of economic and national security policy. The assertion from the Journal's editorial is that this strategy is not just different, it is essentially the opposite of Reagan's guiding philosophy. The dispute with Canada offers a concrete case study. The Ontario campaign used Reagan's 1987 quote to argue, "Tariffs may appear patriotic, but in the long run they hurt American workers and consumers." Trump's response: he claimed the ad misrepresented Reagan and accused the Canadian government of attempting to influence U.S. courts via the ad. He called the ad fake, and announced a halt to all trade talks with Canada. The Canadian government pushed back, stressing the importance of trade relationships and arguing that the ad was simply raising the risks of tariffs for all concerned. One of the key tensions here is historical interpretation. Reagan's legacy is invoked by many for different things: free markets, small government, anti-communism, but on trade his record is nuanced. The Reagan Foundation itself weighed in to say that the Ontario ad misrepresented the context of the 1987 speech, noting that while Reagan did raise tariffs in one instance, he remained skeptical of long-term protectionism. So when the Journal refers to taking Reagan's trade beliefs in vain, it is pointing to the mismatch between the bold tariff-heavy strategy adopted today and the cautious, balanced trade approach Reagan advocated. On a policy level, the consequences of heavy tariffs are familiar: increased costs for consumers and businesses, retaliatory measures by trading partners, disruptions in supply chains, and the specter of trade wars. These were precisely the concerns Reagan raised. Under his logic, get into a tariff escalation and you end up raising prices, reducing competition, and harming domestic industry rather than protecting it. For businesses that rely on integrated global supply chains, a tariff surge can mean higher input costs, disrupted logistics and eventual price increases passed on to consumers. That said, the current environment is not identical to the 1980s. The global trade system is more interconnected, supply chains more complex, and the geopolitical stakes arguably higher. Trump's defenders argue that tariffs are a legitimate tool to reclaim manufacturing and bolster national security, and that decades of trade deficits demand more assertive action. But the Journal editorial suggests that the approach fails both economically and philosophically. Economically because tariffs cause harm to consumers and business, philosophically because the invocation of Reagan is selective and misleading. From the vantage of U.S.-Canada relations, this episode brings real risk. Canada is one of America's closest trading partners, and disruptions there reverberate widely, across energy, agriculture, manufacturing and more. Imposing additional tariffs or breaking off negotiations threatens to unsettle long-standing industrial ties. As the Washington Post reported, Trump raised tariffs by 10% on Canadian imports in October 2025 in response to the ad campaign. The reaction from Canadian business leaders and government officials was that of disappointment and concern about the domino effect on workers and families. It's worth considering how domestic politics plays into all of this. For Trump, trade has always been a theater, a way to signal toughness, champion the domestic worker and confront elites. Invoking historical figures like Reagan amplifies that, but also opens the door to scrutiny about how faithfully those legacies are being honored. For Canada, the Ontario ad campaign was a strategic move to push back on U.S. tariffs by deploying a historically iconic figure for credibility. The result? Escalation rather than resolution. Looking ahead, the stakes are clear. If trade talks remain frozen, if tariffs escalate further, the ripple effects could be significant for global supply chains, inflation, consumer prices and diplomatic relationships. One unintended consequence of aggressive tariffs is that domestic industries may be shielded, temporarily, but at the cost of innovation, competitiveness and higher consumer prices. The economy may pay more in the long run. And for the U.S., alienating a major trade partner like Canada carries not only economic but geopolitical cost. In retrospect, one might imagine what Reagan would have made of today's tariff landscape. His 1987 warning feels timeless. Such trade barriers or restrictions of any kind are steps that I am loath to take. He framed tariffs as a reluctant instrument of last resort, not a first line. What the journal is suggesting is that the current strategy treats them as first line, uses them as theater, and then leans heavily on a selective reading of the past to justify them. One must also mention the broader debate about sovereignty, supply chains and globalization. The trade regimes of the 21st century are not just bilateral deals, they are webs of connections, regional integration, multinational firms, digital commerce, and services as well as goods. A simplistic tariffs vs imports argument, as many economists argue, fails to capture the full spectrum of modern trade. Yet in the arena of politics, simplicity prevails. Make, foreign, pay, protect, our jobs. Neville rational economics seldom gets airtime. The issue illustrated by the Canadian ad and the U.S. response is partly that the story being told is more political than economic, or rather it is economic policy being driven by politics. And when that happens, historical nuance tends to get flattened. It is therefore remarkable how this episode invokes history, branding and policy in one. The renewing of trade tensions between two close countries, the use of a decades-old radio address, and the resulting "you did what?" dynamic between them, these are the things that make modern economic diplomacy far messier than just balance sheets and tariffs. The editorial's assertion that Trump is misusing Reagan brings to light how political leaders may invoke revered figures for legitimization, yet may stray considerably from their actual philosophies. So what should observers, citizens and businesses take away from this? First, that the legacy of trade policy matters. How a former president spoke about tariffs, context, caveats, exceptions, still resonates today. Second, that invoking icons like Reagan does not automatically translate into consistent policy. When policy shifts significantly, as seems to be happening, it raises questions of coherence, credibility and interpretation. Third, that the consequences of tariff escalations extend beyond headline numbers. They involve supply chains, consumer prices, diplomatic relations and long-term competitiveness. Fourth, that when trade becomes theater, the risk is not just economic disruption but historical distortion. In short, the video and underlying article remind us that trade policy is more than a ledger of exports and imports, it is part of a country's identity, its historical narrative, its alliances, and its future. The words of Reagan echo today not simply as nostalgia, but as a cautionary tale. When a grand strategy leans on the past for authority, fidelity to that past becomes as important as the policies being made today. If those policies diverge sharply from the legacy they claim, the legitimacy of that invocation comes under scrutiny. In the case at hand, the journal editorial argues that Trump's tariff agenda not only departs from Reagan's trade philosophy, it misuses it. Whether one agrees or not with Trump's broader agenda, the fundamental question remains: can a policy rooted in protectionism genuinely stand on the legacy of a leader who warned against the exact path it appears to be taking? The answer likely shapes not only U.S.-Canada relations, but the broader credibility of trade diplomacy, the role of historical precedent in policy making, and the capacity of modern states to navigate globalization without falling into the protectionist traps of old. As the trade saga between the U.S. and Canada unfolds, and as the debate over tariffs rages, one thing persists: history matters. And so does how we interpret it. When presidents speak, when ads evoke icons, when trade policy becomes emblematic, the stakes are large. not just for jobs or industry, but for national economic character and the global order. The legacy of Reagan's caution on tariffs remains relevant, and whether today's leaders heed it or ignore it may say a great deal about the shape of global trade in the years ahead.